Okay, continuing on with Module 6. This is part 3. We're still looking at social psychology. Let me start my timer. So groupthink is an emphasis on group unanimity, which means everybody agreeing, at the expense of critical thinking. So groups can become so intent on ensuring that everybody agrees with everybody else that they lose their capacity to objectively evaluate the issues. And as a result, groups can sometimes make poor decisions. For example, back in 2003, the US went to war with Iraq over the claims of weapons of mass destruction that turned out that did not exist, right, as later investigations showed. And even though some members of the administration had their doubts at the time, they kept their doubts to themselves to avoid rocking the boat and upsetting their superiors. And so a nation went to war. So groupthink can be minimized by having the leader refrain from expressing their opinion too early on or too strongly, and by encouraging dissent. So it's all about the tone that the leader of the group kind of sets, right? So you can, as the leader, encourage critical thinking. You can appoint a devil's advocate, right? Like, Justine, your job is to try to find errors with what we're talking about here. And that, gives everybody permission to start to think more critically. Get an independent expert to evaluate the decision. So after the group has come to some decision, get fresh eyes on it to see, what an outside view would say. And even something as simple as a follow-up meeting, 2 days later, reconvening the group and saying, has anybody thought of anything since we made the decision that would make us rethink it? Okay, so social facilitation, social loafing, de-individuation, group polarization, groupthink. Let's turn to conformity. So conformity is altering your behaviors or opinions to match those of others or to match what is expected of you, right? So what makes us conform? We can talk about two big reasons people conform: normative influence and informational influence. So normative influence is when we go along with the group because we want to be liked, we want to be accepted by the group. Remember, we have that need to belong, right? We don't want to look foolish, so we go along with what everybody else is doing. And then informational influence is when we assume that the behavior of the group provides information about the right way to act. So if you're in an ambiguous situation, you're not sure what to do, you do what other people are doing, assuming that they must know something. Like, what's the process for getting on the bus? I guess we line up, right? That would be informational influence. So the big early name here, Solomon Asch's research, providing remarkable evidence of conformity back in the 50s. So with Solomon Asch's study, he used college students. He used initially all guys, although later studies also included females. But, if you were in this study, you would show up at the appointed time. There'd be a bunch of other students sitting around the table, and there'd be an empty seat for you. So you would sit there too. The assumption being, and you're led to believe, that everybody around the table is kind of the same as you. They're there to be part of the study. But those 6 other people are actually in on it. So we call those people confederates when they're pretending to be subjects, but they're actually part of the experiment. And so the researcher tells everyone at the table that they'll be judging the lengths of lines. Which of the 3 lines, A, B, or C, is the same as this standard line, right? So they'd have a bunch of versions of questions like that. And then as the researcher polls the people around the table, everybody's picking the wrong line, right? So they start with like the 6 confederates. And then when they finally get to the real actual participant, this is what the study is actually about. What does the actual participant do when it's their turn? Will they agree with everybody else, even though everyone else said the wrong answer? Or will they stick to their guns and say what they know to be correct? So what Ash found was that 70% of participants conformed to the group norm at least once over a dozen trials. So over 12 line questions, most people cave at least once. So here's what Ash found, because he started to play with the situation now to try to pinpoint what are the variables that can ramp up or dial down conformity? So one thing he played with was the ambiguity of the situation. In other words, how hard the task is. You can make this task harder, right? And as the correct answer becomes less and less obvious, people rely more and more on what everybody else is saying and doing. So as the task gets hard, conformity goes up. He also played with how many other people around the table have to be unanimously saying the wrong answer, right? People experience great pressure to conform when the consensus is unanimous. Conformity grew as the size of the group rose as well. So one question he asked was, how many people have to be sitting around this table? How big does the group have to be? And he found that all you need is like 3 or 4 people to reach maximum conformity. I'm going to skip this stuff and go to peer pressure. So peer pressure operates through normative influence, right? When we feel pressured to behave a certain way or to do a certain thing because we don't want to get teased, we want the group to like us and so on. And in fact, dissenters are typically not treated well by the group. Groups enforce conformity. People need to belong, and people worry about being excluded from the group. And so this gives the group powerful influence over its members. It's hard to be the one standout, right? The one holdout. So normative influence, informational influence, ASH, peer pressure, dissent. Then there's compliance. Compliance is the tendency to agree to do things that somebody else asks you or tells you to do. And there are a number of factors that can increase whether someone is going to comply. Getting someone in a good mood makes them more likely to comply. That's why buttering somebody up before you ask for something often works, right? Mom, you're looking particularly gorgeous today. Can I borrow 20 bucks, right? And then there are these strategies that, marketing and sales people know about as ways to get people to comply, right? Like buy my thing, foot in the door technique. This is where you start with a small request, that's the foot in the door, and then you move to a larger one. So for example, a classmate has missed the last lecture, asks to borrow your notes. Let's say you're nice and you lend them your notes from that class. And then they come back a week later saying, your notes were really good. Can I please borrow like all the ones you've got, right? So that's a bigger ask. You are more likely to say yes to that big request, having already said yes to a small request, versus a scenario where they just come up to you and ask for all your notes, right? Without ever asking for the little request first. So the saying yes to the little request softens you up for saying yes to the bigger request. Then there's the door in the face, which is sort of the opposite technique. You start off with a bigger request that you know you're not going to get. You know they're going to say no to you. And then you back off to what you really want, which seems like a much more reasonable thing now, right? So can I borrow 100 bucks? I don't have 100 bucks to give you. Okay, how about 10? Yeah, okay, right? So the $10 option becomes more palatable because it's being compared to the $100 ask, right? Then there's the lowball technique. This is where you start with a low price or a small request, but then you add on, right? So, if you look at these flyers from car dealerships, for example, you get one of these puppies in the mail, payments as low as $99 a month. You walk in with this flyer and say, give me this deal. I want the $99 deal. They'll say, absolutely, come on in. And when you walk out again, you will not have that deal because turns out everything else is extra. Oh, did you want a steering wheel with that? Oh, did you want, tires? So that's a low ball. They just want you to get in the door and then they're going to work their magic on you and you'll end up paying a lot more than that. All right, so foot in the door in the face, low ball technique. All right, let's talk about Stanley Milgram's research into obeying authority. So Milgram conducted what turned out to be one of the most famous and disturbing psych experiments ever done. He wanted to understand why apparently normal German citizens willingly obeyed orders to injure or kill people during World War II. Like, why did they do that? Why did they obey? I think there's a lot of lessons for the modern day here, too. So Milgram places an ad in the paper asking for participants in a memory study. There's the ad he placed. And when the participant arrives, he meets another person, presumably there to participate as well. Although this person is a Confederate, they're in on it. So they're just pretending to be, another subject. And the experimenter then assigns them roles. One of you is going to be a teacher, one of you is going to be a learner. They draw lots to figure out who's who. It's a rigged draw so that the real participant is always given the role of teacher. So then the person who's given the role of learner, the Confederate, is strapped into a chair, electrodes placed on his arm. The person who's the real participant watches all this happen, and then they're led into an adjacent room where they sit in front of this shock generator. So behind this wall here would be the learner strapped into their chair with electrodes on them. The shock generator has 30 switches marked in 15-volt increments from 15 volts down at the bottom with a descriptor that says mild shock all the way up to 450 volts and XXX, right? So every time the learner makes a mistake on a memory pair task, the teacher gives the next level of shock. So for the first error, they get a 15-volt shock. Next error, it's 30, 45, and so on. Now, the real situation, this guy who's a Confederate, right, strapped to his chair, is not really receiving any electric shocks. So it's all pretend. But the person administering the so-called shocks does not know that. Okay, and there are certain things that happen at certain points in the process. So once you get up to 75 volts, the learner through that wall moans loud enough that the person in front of the shock generator can hear it. At 90 volts, the learner cries out in pain. At 150 volts, the learner screams and asks to be let out of the experiment. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. At 180 volts, they start banging on the wall, also screaming, get me out of here. 285 volts, agonized screams are coming from behind that wall, and they're not answering the word pairs anymore. By 330 volts, the learner is completely silent from there on. So no answering questions, no screams, no grunts, no nothing. So presumably they're unconscious or maybe dead by then. So the real purpose of the study is how many people are going to go all the way to 450 volts because some guy in a lab coat is telling them to, ostensibly killing an innocent stranger because some guy in a lab coat said so. So the prediction before the study, Milgram asked a bunch of psychiatrists at Yale to forecast, like, how many people do you think I'm going to get going all the way to 450? The prediction was that it would be like a fraction of a percent who'd go all the way to 450 volts. The prediction was that at 150, people would stop because it's at 150 that the learner says, let me out of here. And really, from that point on, if this was real, they'd be breaking laws, right? They'd be holding someone against their will and torturing them. So it makes sense that nobody's going to go past there, right? But the findings were, to use a terrible pun, shocking. Only 5 out of the original 40 participants stopped before 300 volts. 65% went all the way to 450. Okay, so 2 out of 3 people went to 450 volts. So once this original finding came to light, he started to play with the setup, the paradigm, to see if he could ramp up or dial down obedience. What factors are contributing here? So he did a version where, the teacher and the learner are next to each other, and the teacher literally has to hold the learner's hand down on an electric plate. If they can see each other, obedience declines. And in the scenario where the teacher has to literally hold the learner's arm down, obedience declines. It's easier to do harm against someone you can't see, right? They did a version where the experimenter gave the orders over the phone. So the guy in the lab coat isn't even in the room anymore. And he's like, call me if you need me. obedience dropped pretty dramatically when the boss leaves the room. In terms of personality characteristics, they weren't really studying personality characteristics. This was a social psychology study. They were looking at the situation, but there's some evidence that people who are especially worried about making a good impression, right, are more likely to be obedient. So Milgram believed that while there are enormous differences between obedience in his laboratory and what happened in Nazi Germany, nevertheless, a common psychological process is involved in both events. Right? There is this appalling willingness to do terrible things because somebody else told them to. Okay. I think I'm going to pause there and we will pick it up with aggression on the next segment.